WMNation.com.
Hello, is this Dr. Singer?
Hi. Yes, Jeff Singer.
Jeff Singer, how are you, sir? Welcome to Matt Connarton Unleashed. It's nice to make your acquaintance.
Oh, nice to meet you, too.
And we should mention, of course, because I do have your bio here, that you are a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and you work in the Center for the Study of Science and the Department of Health Policy Studies. And I know that you wanted to talk about, because we had discussed this ahead of time a little bit, of course, online, that, talking about the opioid crisis and the drug war and how it's made it worse. And of course, when you suggested that, I was immediately on board, because it's something that, I'm very interested in, that I feel passionately about. And I don't know if you've had the chance to hear much of the show, but I often rail against the drug war, or as I call it, the government's war on the American people. And I've seen up close, as obviously you have, examples of how, in particular, with opioids, how the government has made things worse. And we recently, it was a few weeks ago now, we had on the phone with us Dr. Richard Lawhern, also known as Red.
Yes.
And and he spoke about it extensively, and we had a great conversation. And we'll have him back in the future. But I'm also very very excited to talk about this with you. Can you kind of? I'm not even sure where to start, because it's such a big topic. But do you want to talk a little bit about your background and whatnot?
First of all, I'm a practicing physician. I'm still in practice. I'm a general surgeon. I've been practicing since 1981 in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm originally from New York, so you could probably tell by my accent.
Yes.
And I've always also had a deep interest in public policy. So now for the last few years now, I've been a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and I deal in public policy, particularly where it intersects with healthcare. And there's a lot of areas in public policy where it intersects with healthcare. And as you know, the Cato Institute is a libertarian think tank. And because of my background in medicine, it sort of was a natural for me to dip into this issue. Because, in fact, over the years, I have a lot of experience prescribing opioids, because as a surgeon, I I either treat pain or inflict pain for a living. So
right.
I'm very familiar with how dealing with pain. And it's really, as you study this issue, what really is obvious is that really we don't have an opioid crisis. We have a prohibition crisis. That's what this has always been all along. And if you just look at it in a vacuum, where you're just considering that the overdose rate from opioids, and of course opioids is a big, broad, general term. So, for example, heroin is an opioid, fentanyl is an opioid, lots of different opioids. But when you consider the overdose rate from opioids, without looking at it in the broader context of drug prohibition, then it's easy to see that we're going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're doing. And in the process, a lot of innocent people are getting, as is always the case, are getting injured. So if you want to start with that, I could discuss, there's a narrative that needs to be dispelled, and just looking at the government's own numbers, is something very striking that nobody seems to notice. For many years, but certainly for the last this century, the National Institute on Drug Abuse has a division that does the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. They have an annual survey, and what if you look at their own survey, you find that from 2002 until 2000 through 2014, then they changed their terminology, so the trend continues the same, but you can't really state it because it's different terminology. But basically, from 2002 to 2014, the percentage of the population who are, quote, non-medical users of prescription opioids is basically unchanged year after year after year. It's a flat line.
Okay.
According to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health from the government. Also, during that same period, 2002 through 2014, the percentage of people who are what they call prescription painkiller abuse disorder, who have that condition, we would also call it today opioid use disorder, also has been essentially unchanged. It's a flat line from 2002 through 2014. Meanwhile, the government tells us, the CDC tells us that between 1999 and 2016, the number of prescription opioids written tripled.
Okay.
So now they'd like the narrative. First of all, people like simple explanations for things.
Absolutely.
They don't make consent. For every complicated problem, there's a simple explanation and solution, which is wrong.
Right.
And so it's a nice, simple narrative to think that the overdose problem is because these doctors have been convinced by the greedy pharmaceutical companies that opioids have a low addictive potential and a low overdose potential, and they pushed it, and they get all of our young people hooked on these opioids and then become drug addicts. Well, if the prescription numbers have tripled, but the percentage of non-medical users has not changed, and the percentage of people with opioid use disorder has not changed, what does that make you think about the relationship between the number of prescriptions written to patients and the overdose problem? I mean, it's got to make you think there's not a very strong relationship.
Right.
And then there's a lot of other numbers also. For example, according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, less than 25% of non-medical drug users, prescription drug users, say that they get them ever from a doctor. They usually get them from a dealer or a friend. A study that hasn't been paid much attention to, of 27,000 plus patients who were entering drug rehab for OxyContin addiction between 2004 and 2008. It was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry by researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, found that 22% of them said they ever got a prescription from a doctor for their OxyContin. 86% said they were using OxyContin non-medically because they liked the buzz from it. And also, 78% said that they had a history of prior treatment for substance abuse disorder. So you basically, what I've been trying to tell people is that we have a population of people who are using drugs non-medically. Some, you could argue, are self-medicating. They're using licit and illicit drugs, though, obviously outside of the setting of the doctor-patient relationship. Let's put it that way. And there's this population, and some are dying, and the main reason they're dying is because when they obtain things on the black market, it's always more dangerous. That's one of the side effects of prohibition. Back during the days of alcohol prohibition, people were drinking alcohol that was what they call denatured. Actually, the government ordered alcohol that was being made for commercial use to be denatured, so if people tried to drink it, they would get sick and be poisoned, and people were being poisoned. So basically, we're just seeing the latest expression of drug prohibition.
Right.
But what is the government doing? Because we can't seem to disabuse ourselves of this false narrative that it's all because the doctor. You see, they paint the story of like a teenage high school athlete who breaks his leg, goes to the doctor. He's put on oxycodone for his broken leg, and he then is basically smitten by the drug and becomes a drug addict. And now there may be some instances like that.
Oh, sure.
Because there's, nothing's black and white.
Sure.
But that's not the real story. The real story is the kid who's experimenting with drugs at parties, let's say in college or in school, doing alcohol and other things, and somebody introduces them to a prescription opioid, and because rightly by the late 90s we realized that we had this irrational fear of it, so we were actually getting more relaxed about prescribing it. When a buddy of yours in school says you want to try this oxycodone, it'll really make you feel good, you'll think, well, oxycodone, yeah, my mom got that when she had her surgery. That can't be too bad.
Right.
Why would a doctor prescribe it? Sure, I'll give it a try.
Right.
That's more of the story.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm very upset because the real answer is to look at this as a prohibition crisis, but instead we're hurting patients. Patients, because of the government's, because everybody's decided on the wrong narrative, the government is ordering clampdowns on the number of prescription medicines that can be prescribed based on actually not evidence, poor studies, and patients who are in pain are suddenly find themselves cut off from their pain medication. Some are resorting to suicide. Some are in desperation are seeking relief in the black market where you don't know what you're going to get. And then you got doctors, and I'm a practicing doctor. We're all practicing in fear because we know we have these state-based surveillance boards, and they're monitoring us. And if I write what these non-doctors think is too big a prescription, of course, it's nuanced. Medicine is nuanced. Every patient is different and has different requirements.
It becomes a game of...
If I write too much, I might... be walked out in handcuffs after I get a visit from the DEA.
It becomes a game of gotcha.
We're afraid.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think you know what I said to Red about this is I feel like part of it, part of how we got there, how we got stuck with this false narrative is, like you said. I mean, I think it's a couple things. Like you said, people like false, or I shouldn't say I don't mean false. People like easy, simple narratives because then they think, okay, well, then there's an easy, simple solution and whatnot. And like you said, it's not black and white. But I also think, too, part of how we end up here is, the government, are, as I like to refer to them, our elected lawgivers and overlords. In order for them to continue to hold office, they have to look like they're doing something. So in their need to hold power and look like they're doing something, they end up doing things based on a false narrative because at least it allows them to do something. Now, what they're doing ultimately causes and has caused more harm than good, but because they at least look like they're doing something and people are falling for it and buying the narrative, then they get to continue to be reelected because they can say, look what we did. We figured out we'll blame the doctors and we'll start regulating them and it doesn't solve it, but it's progress and at least we did something. And that's...
Yeah, we could check that off and move on to the next thing. And I could tell my constituents when I run for reelection that I took care of it.
Exactly.
Here in Arizona, for example, where I practice, and I know in New Hampshire this is a very big issue. In Arizona, so at the beginning of 2018, the governor, who was going to be running for re-election, he just got reelected. He called an emergency session of the state legislature to deal with the opioid crisis in the first week at the beginning of January. And basically, what they wanted to do. As I'm sure your listeners have heard about this before, and Dr. Lawhorn talked about it, I'm sure. The CDC came out with guidelines in 2016. They call them guidelines for opioid prescribing. Now, if you read it carefully, they state in their own introduction that they're saying that this is meant to be, in their words, suggestive, not prescriptive. They state that most of what they're saying is based on what they call type 4 evidence. This is in their own guidelines. And they define type 4 evidence as being mainly observational with a high risk of being wrong. Okay?
Wow.
They actually said that. And they went on to say, again, I'm paraphrasing them. They said doctors, the clinicians know their patients best and will, of course, weigh the risks and benefits when prescribing to their patients. This is meant just to be sort of like an advisory thing. And then what they said was that this type 4 evidence suggests that most patients with acute pain, in about 3 to 5 days, will worth of taking a prescription opioid will not need it after that. Certainly, a lot of people after 7 days. Now, that's what they said. Most, certainly, a lot of people after 7. They didn't see all. They didn't say this is the thing. Now, when I read this, and when all of practicing physicians, clinicians read this, we basically said, okay, so, tell me something I don't know. You're telling me that, try, obviously, not to overprescribe. You should try not to overprescribe everything.
Right.
Doctors have a tendency to overprescribe antibiotics, antidepressants. Some doctors don't know how to not write a prescription for something. So, I'm not saying we're perfect, but you read this, basically say, okay, thank you very much. I'll kind of tuck that away in the back of my mind as, but I'm generally I'm not going to change what I do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when the politicians got a hold of that, they don't understand nuance. So their interpretation was, so basically you don't need more than 3 to 5 days, and definitely no more than 7 days. Well, then we got the solution here. And since we already decided that this is all due to doctors hooking patients on pain medicine when they come in with a broken leg,
it already fits the narrative.
The first state to do this was Massachusetts. They said, we're just going to put a 7-day limit. In Arizona, in Kentucky, they said 3, because it said, 3.
Yeah.
Arizona, I guess they decided to split the difference. So the governor's recommendation was the legislature pass a rule saying starting this January 1st, 2019, and we're going to have to be every time I write a prescription, I have to actually check in with the monitoring board before the prescription can go out.
Oh, great!
And the limits of 5 days. 5 days. Okay?
5 days.
Now the CDC didn't say that.
Right.
It said that generally speaking, a lot of people 5 days enough. Well, you generally speaking, but that's what's happened. Yeah. So they called this emergency session. They had a lot of other things in there as well, but this is basically what the gist of it. There was no time, apparently, to hold hearings. The Arizona Medical Association and the Arizona Osteopathic Medical Association kind of got wind of what was going to be in the governor's proposal and said, we'd be happy to testify, and we want you to know we think prescription limits is a bad idea. The Goldwater Institute, which is a free market think tank in Arizona, and I'm a visiting fellow there, they said, we'll be happy to, have Dr. Singer testify about his thoughts on this. Well, apparently there was no time to hold hearings because it's such an emergency.
Oh, jeez.
So the session was called on Monday, and the bill was passed and signed into law on Thursday.
Wow.
Okay, unanimous, both houses.
Oh my God.
Bipartisan, unanimous.
Yeah.
In fact, several prominent members of the legislature were saying, "Why are we rushing on this? If this doesn't take effect until January 1st, 2019, don't we have time to kind of think this through before we do this?"
Right.
But then they still voted yes because they didn't want to be, seen as not being in favor of dealing with the opioid crisis.
Exactly.
So the thing passed in 3 days and this emergency. There was such an emergency we didn't have time to get opinions from anybody. It doesn't even, the law doesn't even go into effect until like about 2 weeks from now.
Yeah.
So that's how bad an emergency was. But that's the way they act, all around the country.
Oh yeah.
So it's become, and it's being used also as an excuse. I don't want to get off topic, but it's an excuse now for building the wall. It's funneling into the whole immigration debate.
Oh yeah.
These politicians love useful crises. Are always useful because they make when people are afraid because of a crisis, out of fear, they're willing to accept a lot of things that they otherwise would demand that we take our time and think this thing through.
Fear is the greatest motivator.
Yeah.
You can really motivate people with fear. Yeah.
So that's basically it in a nutshell. So, but if you look, there was a really interesting study that came out from the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center in late September by investigators led by a group by an investigator named Jalal, J-A-L-A-L, and it was published in Science. Any listeners could access it online, and it was really fascinating because this, to me, validates my point. They actually dug into CDC data going back into the 70s, now the CDC every so often changes its terminology, so it's kind of hard to do these studies going back real far because you don't know if you're comparing apples to apples. But they used to call it, instead of overdoses, they used to call it drug poisonings, and there were different drugs within that category. They weren't differentiating so much as a type of drug, but they were able to get a reasonable look at things going back into the 70s. And what they concluded is that overdoses due to non-medical use of drugs has been on a steady exponential rise since the late 1970s, and that the latest expression of it is the opioid overdose issue. But it started off, for example, in the late 70s, early 80s, it was heroin. A lot of soldiers would come back from Vietnam having used heroin in Vietnam.
Sure.
And then from there, we had a cocaine thing, and then things waxed and waned. Then it was Vicodin and oxycodone. We had meth, and people may remember in the early part of the 21st century, we had a meth crisis. It's not gone, by the way.
Right.
Bigger than ever, but we're not talking about that right now.
It was very big here.
And different things come in and out of vogue, and because we have prohibition, there are interventions to try to suppress whatever is the new thing in vogue, and all it does is make things just kind of, it's like pushing a balloon in one side and kind of the air comes out the other. It just makes things move over to other things.
Right.
So, for example, in 2005, we had a meth crisis. And people were making, in meth labs, making using Sudafed to make meth. It's very easy to make Sudafed into methamphetamine. They're very similar chemically. So the first thing the government did in 2005 was require all Sudafed to be sold behind the counter.
I remember that.
And it's a real pain in the rear end to try to get... as you know, you got to give your driver's license, all that.
Oh, yeah.
2 states, Oregon and Mississippi, actually went a step further. They made it only by prescription.
Really? For Sudafed?
Yeah.
Wow. That's astonishing.
So, and it's an excellent decongestant, as you know, and a lot of people who are allergy sufferers...
Like me,
they were missing out.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what ended up happening, and then, of course, they had SWAT teams crack down on all these meth labs in a military style.
Yeah.
Well, meth was about the only business the cartels weren't involved in because there were so many meth labs all over the place. It just wasn't a good market for them.
Wasn't profitable
but
for them.
this opened up a market.
Right.
So they started smuggling in meth from Mexico. So then in 2007, the U.S. government leaned on Mexico to do the same with Sudafed that we do here. But by this time, the cartels now were heavily invested in this new niche. So they learned quickly that you could make meth out of P2P, phenyl-2-propanone. Anybody who's ever watched Breaking Bad knows about that. And so they started making it with P2P, which makes it actually more efficiently. And so that's what they're doing now. So now, if you look at the CDC's own numbers, methamphetamine has been on a steady increase since 2007. And last year, the overdoses from methamphetamine went up 30%.
Oh, wow.
Over the previous year.
That actually surprises
Nobody's talking
me.
about that. But
yeah.
That's going to be as soon as we get tired of talking about opioids, we're going to move back to meth. That's going to be, I'm predicting that in about another year or two.
Yeah.
And interestingly, last year, in Portland, Oregon's statistics, and this is ironic because Oregon is where they made Sudafed only by prescription, overdoses related to methamphetamine actually eclipsed overdoses due to heroin in the city of Portland, Oregon in 2017.
Wow.
And that's, and so now that's their biggest crisis.
Yeah,
and of course, the other thing
me.
that we're noticing, if you look at the CDC numbers, the overdose rate continues to go up year after year after year, but the mix of what those components of the overdoses are has been changing. Because opioids is a very broad category.
Yeah.
So now, according to the latest numbers just released by the CDC, which is last year, it's 2017 numbers, they're always about a year behind, 75% of the opioid overdoses, 75% were heroin or fentanyl. 40% were just fentanyl. And the DEA tells us this fentanyl isn't the fentanyl that you get from prescription. This is powder. It's what they call illicit fentanyl. It's manufactured in labs, mainly in Asia, and smuggled into the United States. It's very easy to smuggle in, and it's actually most of the time sent in by the mail, sometimes by FedEx or UPS.
Really? Wow.
And then dealers have these pill presses, and they press them into counterfeit prescription opioids, because illicit, and that's why it's referred to as illicit fentanyl. The DEA says roughly 99% of the fentanyl they seize is this kind. Because illicit fentanyl is actually not made in a powder. The kind we use in a hospital is usually either in a liquid, an injectable, given for anesthesia mostly, or sometimes it's given to people in severe pain and in critical condition intravenously. But it's also most popularly, when it's prescribed, is as a skin patch, where it slowly gets absorbed over 2 or 3 days.
Right. I know someone who had to have those, who was very eager to be done with them because she didn't want the addiction. Yeah.
Right, but it's not easy to non-medically use because to scrape that stuff off the pad, it's just not practical. So
okay.
That's not the when we hear about fentanyl, it's not this. It's the stuff being made in labs. And then there's so many analogs of fentanyl, like sufentanil, carfentanil. So
carfentanil, I hear about.
The Chinese government, at our urging, has ordered these labs to stop making fentanyl. So they say, okay, we won't make fentanyl. And they start making sufentanil.
Oh.
Because they didn't tell us about that, so and you can very easily change it to different analogs.
Yeah.
So now the majority of overdoses in this country, and you can see each year on the graph, it's just changing. Prescription overdose deaths are actually down a little bit. They were down 9% this year over the previous year. But overall, total opioid overdose deaths are continuing to go up. They're up 11% this year over last year. Why is that? Well, because, we got non-medical users using drugs in the underground market, and when our efforts, since we've decided it's all this prescription opioids that doctors are hooking patients on, all these efforts have succeeded in making prescription opioids tougher or more expensive to get in the black market.
Right.
So the non-medical users just moved over to the easier, cheaper stuff, and the black market is very efficient and is filling the void.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, in the process, the people who really need these prescription opioids are going undertreated.
Right.
It's terrible.
My understanding is too that's how a lot of and I don't know the numbers offhand, but I remember being surprised at one point seeing the numbers of veterans who end up on black market opioids, who end up on heroin or whatever else because they because it's become more difficult for them to get prescriptions filled. And obviously a lot of them come back with chronic pain, and so they end up hooked on whatever they get on the street, and it's and of course that gets into other issues about how we treat our veterans and whatnot. But it's really incredible. I mean, they're one of the from what I've seen, they're one of the prime victims of all of this. Doctor, is there anything, by the way, that the government has gotten right about this, in your opinion? I mean, probably not, but I'm just curious.
I really can't think of anything the government's gotten right.
Yeah,
at all. No,
yeah.
I can't because I've written. I have a policy analysis. It's like a white paper that came out on December 13th. If anybody wants to visit the Cato Institute's website, that's cato.org, and you can find my policy analysis. It's called Harm Reduction: Shifting from a War on Drugs to a War on Drug-Related Deaths. And I get into all of this stuff. My proposals are, number one, stop telling doctors how to practice medicine.
Right.
And stop interfering in the patient-doctor relationship. Let doctors be doctors. Now, admittedly, there were some bad actors out there. There were guys who were selling prescriptions.
Oh, sure.
There were guys who were operating pill mills where, there was this thing called the Oxy Express you probably heard about where, a doctor had to deal with a drug dealer. He had a pain clinic.
Oh, yeah.
People were coming down to Florida, particularly. That's the Oxy Express. They fly down to Florida. They get like gift cards and stuff like that from the dealer, and they get paid
to go
to Dr. So-and-so, and they were told what you're supposed to say, and then Dr. So-and-so will give you a prescription for several, 100 OxyContins, and then make sure you fill it at this particular pharmacy and ask for this guy, and he'll give it to you, and then bring that to me.
Wow.
And that was going on. Now, those guys obviously were unethical, and they've been, for the most part, they're in jail right now, in prison.
Yeah, good.
But I would still argue, what was responsible for that? It was drug prohibition as well, because it was the lure of making money in the black market,
right?
That got corruptible people corrupted.
Of course, of course.
So it's all about prohibition. So number one is stop trying to tell doctors this is how many pain pills a patient needs, et cetera. Just get back out of that. And that's number one. Number two is actually we need to end drug prohibition. Now, I understand that I'm not expecting that to happen anytime soon. I'm not living in a fantasy land. But there are countries that have had some experiences with that. But if you can't do that, then at least then shift the focus to what's called harm reduction in the community, in the drug treatment community. And harm reduction basically is seeking to minimize the harms that are resulting from drug prohibition. It's non-judgmental. It's not saying it's good to do drugs or anything like that. It's saying We're never going to have a drug-free society because that's a fantasy.
Right.
So if you're going to be using drugs that are usually obtained on the black market, so you can't trust them, you don't know what's in them or anything, let us do some things to make it where you're less likely to kill yourself and less likely to spread disease.
Right, right.
And if you want to do something, that's what you should be doing. So, what kind of things can we do about it? Well, first of all, there is a country that had experience with this whole thing back in 2001 in Portugal. Portugal at the time had the highest drug overdose rate in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And if you read the original interviews with their head of their ministry that dealt with this, they didn't look at this as basically saying, forget it, we can't do this, as critics would say. They weren't throwing in a towel. They basically said, well, we've been trying for all these years, it isn't working. Let's see if this works.
Mm-hmm.
Getting drug deaths down. That's exactly the approach they had. So they decriminalized. They didn't legalize. They decriminalized.
Right, which is a common that's a common misconception. So I'm glad you said that, because a lot of people I talk to about Portugal, they're under the impression that Portugal just did like this blanket legalization of everything, where it actually is more nuanced than that.
Yeah, I mean, it's politically easier to do but legalized would be better because but decriminalized is basically saying, as far as we're concerned, it's still illegal. We don't approve of this, but we're not going to put you in jail for this.
Right.
And they still actually go after big-time drug smugglers. But if a policeman sees you on the street shooting up, he'll tell you to stop doing that and get away from me. Mm-hmm. Get out of my sight. That's about all they'll do.
Yeah.
And they have little ways of trying to coax you into getting into rehab. So that was 2001. So the latest information from 2015, they have now the lowest overdose rate in Europe, 6 overdoses per million population, as opposed to the U.S., which has 312 per million population with our, zero tolerance. They also had a 75% reduction in heroin addicts in the country.
Wow.
And the minister attributes that to the fact that since people who were users were no longer afraid of being treated like criminals,
mm-hmm.
they were less hesitant to kind of come out of the shadows and ask for help.
Exactly.
That's what they're attributing it to.
Yep.
So that's one example. Now, the downside of just decriminalization is they're still using stuff that you got on the black market, so you don't really know if when they tell you it's heroin with fentanyl or just heroin, things like that. So that's still dangerous, whereas it was completely legal, like alcohol is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I go to the market to buy a bottle of bourbon, let's say, it never even occurs to me that the percent alcohol content that it says on the label is really not that. That never crosses my mind. I believe what it says on the label.
Right.
I don't think it's been adulterated with any poison.
Right.
Because it's legal.
Right, exactly.
And so there's recourse, there's accountability. And there's competition, too.
Yeah.
But when it's illegal, incidentally, I don't know how many people know about Prince. The coroner in the spring of this year released the actual report on how he died. He was a non-medical user of Vicodin, hydrocodone. That's what he liked to use.
Okay.
The records show he never, ever went to a doctor. He had a dealer who got him his Vicodin.
Yeah.
And, so he didn't, break his leg and get hooked on Vicodin when he was a high school basketball player or anything like that. So,
yeah.
So anyway, one day his dealer got him Vicodin, and again, it was this fentanyl that was pressed by a pill press into a counterfeit Vicodin pill. It said Vicodin.
Oh.
I don't think the dealer necessarily was even. We don't know.
The dealer may not have had.
In it, or he may have
no
obtained
idea
it from someone else. We don't know.
Yeah.
So he took these pills thinking he was taking Vicodin.
Oh.
That's what he overdosed on.
Wow.
100% fentanyl he overdosed on.
I didn't realize that.
Again, that's the problem. Even if you have decriminalization, you can't avoid that kind of thing from happening.
Right.
So legalization is more ideal, but politically speaking, it's much easier to get decriminalization than legalization, and decriminalization goes a long way towards making things better.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like baby steps, really. I mean, even here in New Hampshire, where I am, it's amazing how long it took with cannabis just to even get to decriminalization. Meanwhile, everyone around us has gone full legal. But it's it's kind of like we're getting there a little bit at a time, and we're getting there a little bit at a time with cannabis, and maybe eventually, we'll get there with everything. So ideally, what you're advocating for ultimately is a full legalization across the board. It sounds like
ideally legalization, but second best is decriminalization. But realistically, at least for the short term, for the time being, let's just do harm reduction. Let's just the focus shouldn't be on I don't want people taking these drugs. The focus should be on I don't want people dying from these drugs.
Right.
You just got to add a couple, like one or two words into that sentence. Dying from. That's our concern should be. We want to see people hurt themselves, as opposed to we don't want to see them use that.
Yeah.
That's what we got to shift the focus to.
I notice too. You use the term prohibition a lot, which I think is smart because a lot of people don't. When they make this argument that you and I make, a lot of people don't use that term, and I think it's smart to use that term because it kind of reminds people that, look, we tried prohibition with alcohol, and obviously it didn't work, and you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone, I mean, there are people, I'm sure, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who would make the argument that we never should have ended alcohol prohibition, people generally. I mean, it's accepted, right. I think, broadly that was a bad idea. So I think it's smart to kind of remind people, well, this is really the same thing, just not with alcohol, but it doesn't work for all the same reasons. I mean, not exactly the same, obviously, but in terms of broad principles, it fails for the same reasons that prohibition of alcohol
always
did.
Fails.
Right.
I mean, it presupposes that there are willing, sellers and willing buyers. There are people who want to engage in a consensual activity. Mm-hmm. And you're prohibiting it. Well, if they want to engage in a consensual activity, all you're doing by prohibiting is making sure that this consensual activity takes place underground,
right,
in a more dangerous atmosphere. Whether you're prohibiting prostitution or drugs or alcohol,
gambling.
The Cato Institute had a study out earlier this week. David Beer, who's one of our immigration policy analysts, came out with a study showing that with the advent of legalization of cannabis in many of the states in this country now, the DEA has reported a dramatic drop in marijuana seizures.
Oh, okay.
Contraband marijuana.
Yeah.
And, of course, it stands to reason. As it's gotten legal, it's kind of killed the smuggling market.
Right.
Because it's legal. Same kind of thing. You could even extend that to the consensual migration of labor, people seeking work. You make it illegal by building a wall or something like that.
Right.
You're just helping the ladder industry. That's all you're doing.
Yes, and the shovel industry, because they dig tunnels and they come through that way.
Shovels, ladders.
Yeah.
As long as there are people who want, the consensual. It's a consensual, peaceful act that you're trying to prohibit.
Right.
Oh, and the other thing is you're making it more dangerous, too, because it's no longer peaceful. So, for example...
Yes, exactly.
When people dealing in drugs have an argument, let's say different dealers have a dispute over territory, they can't go to court.
Right.
So they have drive-by shootings and gang wars. Same thing happened during the days of alcohol prohibition, with all these, when Chicago became like a war zone. Because that's the only way you could settle your disputes. You can't do it peacefully.
Right.
Same thing with human smuggling, which is very dangerous. All those things are made dangerous by prohibition. So as a general rule, if you look at whatever it is, if you're trying to stop, a peaceful consensual activity, all you're doing is making that. You're going to make it. It's going to continue. You're not going to succeed, but you're going to make a lot of people get hurt in the process. That's what you're going to do.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. I mean, that's kind of one of my arguments too about why we should end the drug war is to, really kind of try to eliminate the drug related violence. I tell people too, in a lot of cities where maybe you'll have a big drug bust where they round up a whole bunch of people who are part of this drug ring and put them in jail and whatnot. And it looks great in the newspaper and everyone feels great about it. Oh, look, they rounded up all these people and caught all these people. But then what happens is that nobody talks about is then immediately after that, there's an uptick in violence on the streets of that city because now because that's an industry where, if people are trying to move up the ladder, it's not like you want to be the new drug kingpin. You don't submit a resume and have an interview and whatnot. You shoot the other people who are trying to be the new drug kingpin. And so you end up with these drug dealers shooting each other in the streets. And, So let's end all that. Let's end all this madness and just stop
another
it.
thing is what economists call the iron law of prohibition, which is prohibition tends to promote the development of more concentrated substances that are being prohibited. So during alcohol prohibition, for example, they didn't smuggle in, beer and wine. They smuggled in whiskey. You want it just makes sense if you're in the smuggling business, in a drug dealing business, you want to get something that's more compact and you can get more potency out of a smaller amounts. It's easier to smuggle, and it's easier to subdivide once you get it into the country. So many people think that, for example, crack cocaine might not have been invented at all if cocaine hadn't been prohibited.
Interesting.
It's actually a Schedule II drug, so it's not totally prohibited. It's Schedule II, which is the same as Percocet.
Right.
And
interesting.
Because it is used in the medical setting, but still, if you're trying to smuggle in the black market, crack cocaine, you can get it in much more potent in smaller amounts, and heroin is now being adulterated with fentanyl because you can get this. You can smuggle in smaller packets of heroin, small quantities of heroin, because the fentanyl is making it so much more powerful.
Yeah.
So those kind of things. So another harmful effect of prohibition is that it tends to, if it's a substance we're talking about, it tends to make it creates market incentives to develop more potent and potentially dangerous forms of that substance.
Absolutely. So what we'll let you go in a couple minutes, Doctor. You've been very generous with your time today, but
I'm happy to talk.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. But I want to ask you this though. I mean, what's is there any hope? Let's try to end on a positive note. I mean, is there anything that you see happening that you're encouraged by? In terms of, and if the answer is no, that's okay. But I mean, is there anything that you think is happening where maybe the government's going to finally start to get this right?
Yeah, I think actually I am. I guess I have to be optimistic to be doing what I do. Because I wouldn't do it otherwise if I didn't think it was a way to persuade. But look what's happening with marijuana. It takes a long time. So we're on the verge. The United States now is sandwiched in. Mexico to our south, Canada to our north have completely legalized marijuana for recreational use. In our country, there's 29 states that have marijuana legal in one use or another. The writing's on the wall. That's going to happen. It took many years, and it started off, interestingly, with medical marijuana. That sort of changed people's perceptions of marijuana.
Right.
And I don't know how many more years we're going to have to see people dying from fentanyl. And like I say, once this curve starts to stabilize, it's because it's going to be taken over by methamphetamine. So total overdose rates are going to still continue to go up. It's just going to be a different substance. Sooner or later, I think that the public is always ahead of the politicians, because the politicians are following, but not leading.
Right.
So as more and more, we're hearing more and more people. I just know in my social media feed, more and more people are speaking out and saying, "This is crazy. I'm not an addict. I need this oxycodone for my pain. It's what allows me to go to work and have a meaningful life." And so I think the people are going to push the politicians into backing off. And the next step is to get harm reduction. And when we have harm reduction and people see that they, like, for example, if you have a supervised injection facility, like they have since the 1980s in over 100 places in the developed world. We got in Canada, we got everywhere except the U.S., where you can come in a clean clinic setting. Unfortunately, you have to bring your own because it's illegal. But you're given a clean needle and syringe. You're given a test strip to test it to make sure it's not laced with fentanyl. Because there's a way to test for that. Then you inject. Your needle and syringe is discarded safely, so you can't sell it or use it on the street and share a dirty needle. And there's a person standing there with naloxone in case you overdose to save your life. And also to try to coax you into getting some help.
Right.
A rehab center or something like that. That's harm reduction. That's not allowed in this country because, in fact, just recently, the Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein had an op-ed in the New York Times saying if it's against the law to allow illegal substances on your premises. If you try to do this, we will come after you. So, but if we start loosening up, allowing things like that, which kind of make sense, just intuitively they make sense.
Yeah.
If they start to happen and people start to look at people who have a drug problem as having a drug problem, they're not bad people. They have an addiction is a disease, just like alcoholism is. Or some people are not even addicted. They just like to use it occasionally, just like people like to have a drink occasionally.
Right.
So when they'll start, the attitudes have to change, and when the attitudes change, then the politicians will relent, because then there's nothing in it for them anymore. But it could take a long time yet, and a lot more people are going to die needlessly. Right.
We have to keep pushing. Doctor, anything before we let you go? Anything you want us to know about resources online, websites? I mean, obviously cato.org, but anything else you want people to know, or how they can reach you, or
I
learn
can
more
be
about
reached
you?
At my. I have an email address. It's jsinger@cato.org.
Okay.
You can visit my bio page. If you go to cato.org, you'll find me under experts, and you click on the page. It has all the stuff I've written. But I'm not the only person there who deals with this issue. For example, Jeffrey Myron, who's the director of economics at the Cato Institute. He's also a Harvard economics professor. He's been dealing with the drug prohibition issue way before me. He's written extensively on this. And then we have some other people in our criminal justice department, like Trevor Burrus and Clark Neely, who deal with it from the criminal justice standpoint. So there's a lot of people, a lot of resources at the Cato Institute on it. We've been fighting this battle since when we were formed in 1977. It's nothing new for us.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, Dr. Jeff Singer, thank you so much, and I hope to have you back soon in the new year. We can talk about this more and some other things, and we're running out of time, but you've been very generous with your time today. Thank you so much. And
thank you for having me. Have a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, everybody.
Thank you. You too. All right. We'll talk soon. Take care, my friend. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
IPMNation.com.